Okay, hello everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Pim, and I'm going to be doing my presentation on Alexander Hamilton. As has been referenced, Lyndon LaRouche created his 4 laws in reference to 4 reports that Hamilton wrote, so we should figure out what actually Hamilton did. First, I want to talk, though, a bit about what's been referenced by Bob about the current state of the financial system. LaRouche, around 1975, even earlier, forecast the inevitable collapse of the current monetary system. This was based on a few factors, mainly the fact that Richard Nixon had taken the United States off the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates. And if you remember Bob's slide on the energy flux densities, there was a shutdown in the physical economy where now you would usher in a post-industrial society or a consumer society with zero growth. Profit. So you have an exponential increase here in the amount of currency that's available, in the amount of revolving credit, which is credit cards, auto loans, mortgages. You saw, if you remember Bob's presentation, a massive increase in the amount of financial derivatives available. These are really just speculative contracts. At the same time, you have an exponential increase in financial aggregates, which are stocks and different kinds of bonds. But the physical output of the economy, which is its industry, its science, the state of its infrastructure, and the development of new forms of physical economic output, completely collapses, not only through lack of investment, but also through looting. You know, most of these things have been liquidated and sold off. People talk about, jobs and industries being shipped out to Mexico and to China. This is all one part of a greater whole. So this is the situation we find ourselves in today. This goes up to 2009. Obviously, in 2008, the whole system collapsed. The bankers and governments did something called quantitative easing, which is simply printing money to bail out the speculators, and they manipulated interest rates to lower them to try and just kick the can down the road. But ultimately, what happens is a hyperinflationary collapse, like what happened in the 1920s in Germany. These are kids stacking up billions of dollars of Deutschmarks, but they can't even buy, a dozen eggs. What had happened in their case was Germany was formerly a very industrial nation. They actually were one of the greatest promoters of the American system of economy. But after World War II, with the imposition of Versailles by the British, their physical industry was completely looted, and the Germans had to basically print money to keep the government running. And this is what happened.
After the First World War?
Yeah, after the First World War. Same thing in Zimbabwe more recently in 2008. These are my friends. They're both billionaires. They're extremely poor. So what this all means is that money in itself has absolutely no value if you don't have any of the physical stuff that humans need to survive and to thrive. If you cut that out, then we can all be billionaires, but we're all going to be super poor. And that's the crisis we're facing. So the first solution to this, as Lynn has continually stressed, is Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall is the holy cross for the vampires on Wall Street. It would allow us to separate all these speculative debts, the monetary and financial aggregates you saw, figuring out which ones are legitimate and which ones are fraudulent. Take the fraudulent ones, just write them off. We would have an experience that's almost like Christmas, where we would put certain bankers in jail who were responsible for these years of looting. And we can take everything that's legitimate still left, pensions, people's deposits and savings, real loans that were made to businesses, although there's not much left, but we could reorganize that in a national bank, set up a credit system, and get back to financing the types of infrastructure that were mentioned along the lines of the New Silk Road. Now, this principle actually comes from Alexander Hamilton, and it should become clear as we get into that what he did.
Excuse me, do we interrupt you during your presentation?
no time for questions. But please write them down. I'll take them after. It's just, things should become clear as we go along. So this is Alexander Hamilton. He's a very famous man. Here's a bit about his life. He was born in the West Indies in 1975, or 1755 or 1757. It's not quite clear. He was educated by a pastor called Hugh Knox, who was actually an intelligence agent for Ben Franklin in the Caribbean. So it was Knox who first, introduced Hamilton to certain books, classical literature, inspired him to Christianity and those values, gave him a real opposition to slavery, which is really important. Hamilton was confronted at this age, every day to the evils of slavery. And he was also made aware of the evils of the British Empire, specifically the British East India Company, which was at the heart of that empire. So Hamilton showed a lot of potential, and Mr. Knox actually organized for him to go to the mainland, where he studied at King's College in New York, which is now Columbia University. And this is where he met some of that became the core leadership and intellectual nucleus around George Washington, and these four were really close friends in shaping the Constitution, the U.S. economic system, and really fighting for justice. Mr. John Jay, Gouverneur Morris, and Robert Livingston. They really were the ones from the northern part of the country that always, from the start, opposed slavery. They were never for it whatsoever. Going on, Hamilton during the war was aide-de-camp, personal aide of George Washington. He was a colonel. He was an intelligence officer. And because he showed such a knack for finance, he became George Washington's first Treasury Secretary. At that point, he wrote 4 reports which were mentioned: the public credit, the national bank, the constitutionality of the bank, and the report of manufacturers. And these reports became sort of the basis for what's called today the American system of political economy. It was named like that only about a century later. Ironically, this is what's practiced by China today, not the United States. The United States is purely under British free trade. They don't do anything of the American system really anymore. Eventually, in 1804, Hamilton was murdered in a duel by a traitor, a British agent, and also the first Vice President of the United States, Mr. Aaron Burr, who then fled to London. He was sheltered by British intelligence, and he continued his work to try and destroy the United States, specifically the conception that Hamilton had of what the United States Republic should be. He was actually working with some of these southern slave owners around Thomas Jefferson. Some of their presidents, like Martin Van Buren later, these were all associated with Aaron Burr. So to get a real sense of what Hamilton, of what kind of character he has in creating the economic system, we can see this in the Declaration of Independence. So this is the preamble. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The key component here is this idea of the pursuit of happiness. This comes directly from Gottfried Leibniz, who was mentioned. What they mean by pursuit of happiness is the idea that mankind's greatest joy comes from making scientific discoveries, from developing their creative potentials, and from setting themselves free from things like poverty, from ignorance, and the limitations that mankind face. This is what Hamilton and Washington and Franklin, what they had in mind. The Southerners around James Madison and Thomas Jefferson took a more an approach that comes from John Locke, which would be life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. So their idea was nothing based, there was no morality in it. Locke believes that man is just an animal, it increases its pleasure and avoids pain, accumulates property, it doesn't have, man doesn't know inherently right from wrong, so the government is just there to impose a sort of social contract that everyone accepts certain laws, really the rich accept certain laws, so that they don't steal from each other and you've got sort of this base, but it's really just there to defend slavery. here's the preamble to the U.S. Constitution, and this was really where the fight took place after the Revolution. This preamble was fought for by Hamilton, probably one of the most. It says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty, to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America." So the government is not just there to have certain laws, protect states' rights, protect the property of the people living there. It's an active principle that the government is there to promote the development of the people, to improve the nation, to go for this pursuit of happiness, to help people do that. It's not just there to protect certain rich oligarchs that are slaveholders. There were concessions that had to be made by these Northerners to get this conception into the Constitution. For example, they had to move the capital from New York into the swamplands in Virginia, which we call Washington, D.C. today. It's no longer a swamp, but metaphorically it's more of a swamp than ever. As well, they always had this fight around slavery. The circles around Hamilton didn't want any slavery. The Southerners wanted every slave to have the right to vote, which would allow the South to elect more people to Congress, have more power in choosing the president, and just allow them to expand slavery all over the country. The compromise that they found was that every slave would have 3/5 of a vote, which still had the effect of having new states come in and be slave states, increasing the power of these states' rights people in Virginia and in Tennessee and so forth. And ultimately, this almost tore the Union apart, and it took Abraham Lincoln to fight a civil war to finally put an end to slavery and return to this Hamiltonian conception of developing the nation. So this is actually a century after the founding of the United States. This is at the Centennial Exposition, where nations came from around the world to see the kinds of developments the U.S. had made in machine tools and industry and in building trains, and really bring the American system home to their nations, as opposed to the British, who simply paid their debts by looting other countries. And this is in China. They ran 3 opium wars against them, where they flooded the market with opium, and they used a bank called the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC, to launder all that money. HSBC has not stopped laundering drug money whatsoever. They were caught, I think it was 3 years ago, laundering money for Mexican drug cartels. They're just hiding it, but they're still doing it. So, let's look at what Hamilton actually faced as a problem after the Revolution. You had 13 different states, each with different amounts of debts, the total of which, when compiled together, was about $54 million, with an annual interest of $2.2 million. That's at 4% after Hamilton managed to get it lowered. The value of this debt, land, real estate, different assets, also collapsed and were now subject to speculation. So this means that people didn't think that the government was going to pay this debt back, so they were selling it out of panic for 50 cents on the dollar, and then other people thought, hey, what if the government does pay it back? I could make a killing. And so they would buy this debt up. So what you had was the value going up and down, but mostly collapsing. Then the United States had no actual money. They had no common currency. They were dependent on foreign coins and foreign income. They had no industry and no manufacturing, so they were dependent still on Britain to supply them with goods. And Britain wasn't too happy that they just lost the war, so they started having a trade war against them. So the costs of living were going up. So what this actually meant was, right after the Revolution, they faced the complete dismemberment of the United States. And it was Hamilton who solved this problem. What he did, his first action was to take all the different debts and consolidate them under the federal government. That if you remember what was said in the Constitution to solidify and create a more perfect union, this was one of the ways he brought the interests of all 13 states together. He funded the foreign part of the debt with new loans at lower interest, mainly from France and some from Holland. He offered existing debt holders a sort of new deal at a lower interest rate in exchange for a longer term, some land. But the idea was to bring every creditor in the same interest and to say, no, the United States, we're going to develop, we're going to pay this debt. Also, while the debt was below par, or below what its actual value was, the government would just buy back the debt and they'd create savings that way. And the rest of the interest was funded by sin taxes on spirits, teas, coffee, and bad grammar. Some people are asking, well, why not default? Why pay this debt? People like Jefferson were saying, well, what's the point? People know we fought a revolution, we can't pay it. Why should we do it? And here's what Hamilton says. First of all, to justify and preserve their confidence, to promote the increasing respectability of the American name, to answer the calls of justice, to restore landed property to its due value, to furnish new resources both to agriculture and commerce, to cement more closely the union of the states, and to add to their security against foreign attack. But there's something more. Hamilton knew that a well-funded public debt could actually serve the purposes of money. That people didn't just have to trade in gold. You could actually create a banking system funded with this debt, and people would actually, well, instead of just trading in gold, I have this $100 bond that I know the government is going to pay back in gold and silver, and I'm making 4% interest on it. Why not just trade this with somebody else? It could function as money in that way. So he says, it is a well-known fact that in countries in which the national debt is properly funded and an object of established confidence, it answers the most of the purposes of money. Transfers of stock or public debt are the equivalent to payments in specie. In other words, stock in the principal transaction of business passes as current as specie. The same thing would, in all probability, happen here under the like circumstances. I think that's fairly clear. So let's look, because Hamilton actually used this public credit, now well-funded, that it was stable, people had confidence in it. He used it to create a banking system. So let's look quickly at how banks actually work when they're not, these investment speculative banks. You have 4 elements. Depositors who put their money into the bank for safekeeping, they earn a small interest rate. The bank, which has a certain capital, which I'm saying here can be held in cash, in precious metals, in well-funded debt, but this forms the base from which they can lend. These banks, obviously, they lend out to borrowers, people who want to start businesses, people who need houses, and so on and so forth. And actually that principle there, if you want to not have hyperinflation, well, there's a supply and demand component, but the bank will only create credit when there's a demand for it. It's not an arbitrary thing. The bank, the way it actually earns profit is by making the spread between what they pay on deposits and interest and what they earn from their loans. And it's the shareholders who created the capital in the first place who, get half-yearly, quarterly, yearly dividends on this. Now, in a solid banking system, banks can actually leverage their deposit base, where they can lend out multiple amounts of what they have on deposit, because they know not everybody's going to take their money out of the bank at the same time. Actually, usually what they do is they withdraw, they pay somebody, that person puts it back into the bank. Today it's even simpler, they're just, from one checking account to the next, it never even leaves the banking system. As long as the bank has enough capital in case to cover certain costs. Like this is what we saw in Greece. People lost confidence in the banking system. They started pulling their money out. Well, in that case, that kind of lack of confidence collapses the whole system. Right? So it has to be based on security and a certain confidence, which does not come from the value of money. It comes from, is there a progress in the economy? Is there industry? Is there, are we building the world land bridge? Are we going to space? Is there actual physical progress? So here's what Hamilton says about the national bank and the credit system. He says the augmentation of the active capital or productive capital of a country, gold and silver, when they are employed merely as the instruments of exchange and alienation, have not been improperly denominated dead stock. So he's just saying if you just save gold and you use that to pay, that's what he means by dead stock. It's just kind of lying there. But when deposited in banks to become the basis of a paper circulation, which take their character and place as the signs or representatives of value, they then acquire life, or in other words, an active and productive quality. I keep reading. Purchases and undertakings in general can be carried on by any given sum of bank paper or credit as effectually as by an equal sum of gold and silver, and thus by contributing to enlarge the mass of industrial and commercial enterprise, banks become nurseries of national wealth. The intrinsic wealth of a nation is to be measured not by the abundance of the precious metals contained in it, but by the quantity of the productions of its labor and industry. So although Hamilton was a financial wizard and he knew what he was doing, he knows that money has no intrinsic value, that the goal of a credit system is always to build the nation, whether it's by what he called internal improvements, canals, roads, ports, schools, hospitals, or whether it's founding societies like what he did, the Society for Useful Manufacturing, to find new ways to manufacture things more quickly and more efficiently. This idea of increasing the productive powers of the labor force so that each human being produces much more with much less effort. That's what Hamilton's economics are about, and his report on manufacturers is literally all about that principle. So here's the constitution of this bank really quick. This was a bank that was run by private directors that had to be citizens, specifically 25 of them. The government had no part to play in the direction of the bank. They did not make any of the decisions, though they owned a part of the stock of the bank. In this case, the capital was $10 million, mostly funded by the public debt. And the government owned $2 million worth of the stock. And they could have weekly audits of this bank to know what's going on. And if it was really in trouble, they could go in and reorganize it. But they didn't take any part in making the decisions. Hamilton says, public utility is more truly the object of public banks than private profit, and it is the business of government to constitute them on such principles. It is to be considered that such a bank is not a mere matter of private property, but a political machine of the greatest importance to the state, meaning that the bank and the government were partners, and they would invest together in projects that were feasible, and people who were entrepreneurs and needed capital could go to this bank for their own loans, and it would function essentially like any commercial bank today. Well, they should function. This is completely different than the central banking system that we have today. There's a lot of slanders against Hamilton, saying he's a monarchist. He set the basis for central banking. Today, that's Hamilton banking. It couldn't be more opposite. Central banks, whether it's the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Canada, the European Central Bank, these are entirely privately owned. The identity of the shareholders is top secret. We can't know who owns the Federal Reserve. The government has no oversight. The Federal Reserve hasn't been audited in over 50 years. We don't know really what's going on there. They have the power to print money and to issue currency. And they actually lend this to the government to cover the budget deficit. In Hamilton's National Bank, the National Bank couldn't loan more than $50,000 to the government. This is not meant to cover expenses. And if you want to know how the Iraq War was financed, look at the Fed. So what this actually is you have private interests controlling the finances of the nations of the world, and deciding what you can invest in and what you can't. This is really how governments are controlled. It's through the money. And then you have political figures that are subservient to these people. Hamilton was completely opposed to this. I think these quotes make it clear. The stamping of paper is an operation so much easier than the laying of taxes that a government in practice of paper emissions would rarely fail in any such emergency to indulge itself too far in the employment of that resource to avoid as much as possible one less auspicious to present popularity. So if the government can print money, they're going to abuse that power, which is what we're seeing with the Fed today. The U.S. government wants to do something like fund a war, the Fed can finance that. It says also, it will only follow that it, the government, ought not to desire any participation in the director of it, the bank, and therefore ought not to own the whole or principal part of the stock. For if the mass of the property should belong to the public, and if the direction of it should be in private hands, this would be to commit the interests of the state to persons not interested or not enough interested in their proper management, which is exactly what today's central banks are. Now, the finances of the government controlled by people we really don't know. So let's go through quickly, now that we know these principles, how we would finance a recovery today. I've used the example of Hamilton's National Bank, but we can use how to do this today. So the bank would be financed by the government, in part, who pays the interest on the debt through various taxes, private citizens who can become directors of the bank, and also foreign investors who can buy stock in the bank, but they can't be directors. Then, with this idea of $10 million, the bank takes deposits and they can lend out, let's say, $100 million. Doesn't need to be arbitrary, but today it's more a 10-to-1 ratio. Hamilton said 2 to 3. It really depends on the confidence people have in the system. The way the bank invests is you need a development program. In Hamilton's time, it was the Erie Canal. They dug a 374-mile canal between Lake Erie and the Ohio River. And what this did was transform the entire region. It actually made New York City the hub of trade and commerce of the entirety of North America, still today. You couldn't predict over time what kind of new industries and businesses would be created out of this. You just know that that's going to happen as you're shaping the physical economy. Bob mentioned that this is a new platform, and that's exactly what it does. You're completely increasing the productivity of the labor force of the land area, and ultimately you're going to create a new tax base for the government, which will allow you to pay back the initial loans that it took to build the project. And in the meantime, you create taxes in other ways just to fund the debt while this is being built. So a credit system is really a principle of the future. The value lies in what you're going to build, and you emit the credit to do that. And it's not inflationary because you're always investing in productive assets. Here Hamilton says that the creation of a debt should always be accompanied with the means of extinguishment. This he regards as the true secret for rendering public credit immortal. So credit system really it's about physical value in the future. It's not about monetary value. If you really think about it, who in their right mind wants to collect little pieces of paper with pictures of the Queen on them? What value does that really have? Here's that quote again. Just read it and digest this for a bit. This is so powerful. That the way you make credit immortal is by when you create a debt, you also create the means of extinguishment. This is what it looks like according to LaRouche's dual curve. You have an exponentially expanding financial system. You're taking on more and more debt at an increasing rate. And that's a very good thing if your physical economy and your production and your means of extinguishment is accelerating at an even more rapid rate. A monetary system like we have today is the complete opposite. We don't have this idea of credit. If you want to build something, you have to save for it. The government has to take a part of their budget. That means they have to cut spending in other places, which basically means austerity. Today it's not even infrastructure investments, it's bailing out the banks. It's literally financing speculation. Like your tax dollars are financing gamblers in Las Vegas. That's really what it is. And they lost, they're completely bankrupt. So debt goes up, austerity goes up, ultimately people suffer. The rest of the funds come from private investors, which means that they're going to be looking for a monetary profit. So the infrastructure that they do build has to be either, you build a power plant, but the fees are exorbitant. Or you build a road, there's a massive amounts of tolls. So they place the value really on monetary profit. Everything else is deemed uneconomical. Projects are financed by borrowed funds or saved and paid in cash, which results in austerity. This really is a system of control that's used by imperialists, mainly the British Empire, to prevent the development of nation states. Money is never the issue. And with the Silk Road today, with the AIIB, the New Development Bank, the potential of taking the debt that the United States owes to China and Japan and just say, hey, why don't you help fund a national bank? Let's use $2 trillion, lend out multiple trillions, and we would be partnered with the two greatest infrastructure builders in the world. We could solve this problem easily. There's no lack of money, there's no lack of ideas, there's a lack of will. And it falls on everybody in this room to figure out and read Hamilton's reports and fight for this new conception. Because like Bob mentioned, the people outside, they don't really know what's going on. We should tell them about it. This is all one part of a greater whole. So this is the situation we find ourselves in today. This goes up to 2009. Obviously in 2008, the whole system collapsed. The bankers and governments did something called quantitative easing, which is simply printing money to bail out the speculators. And they manipulated interest rates to lower them, to try and just kick the can down the road. But ultimately, what happens is a hyperinflationary collapse, like what happened in the 1920s in Germany. These are kids stacking up billions of dollars of Deutschmarks, but they can't even buy, a dozen eggs. Okay, hello everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Pim, and I'm going to be doing my presentation on Alexander Hamilton. As has been referenced, Lyndon LaRouche created his 4 laws in reference to 4 reports that Hamilton wrote, so we should figure out what actually Hamilton did. First, I want to talk, though, a bit about what's been referenced by Bob about the current state of the financial system. LaRouche, around 1975, even earlier, forecast the inevitable collapse of the current monetary. What had happened in their case was Germany was formerly a very industrial nation. They actually were one of the greatest promoters of the American system of economy. But after World War II, with the imposition of Versailles by the British, their physical industry was completely looted, and the Germans had to basically print money to keep the government running. And this is what happened.
After the First World War.
Yeah, after the First World War. Same thing in Zimbabwe more recently in 2008. These are my friends. They're both billionaires. They're extremely poor. So increase in the amount of financial derivatives available. These are really just speculative contracts. At the same time, you have an exponential increase in financial aggregates, which are stocks and different kinds of bonds. But the physical output of the economy, which is its industry, its science, the state of its infrastructure, and the development of new forms of physical economic output completely collapses, not only through lack of investment, but also through looting. Most of these things have been liquidated and sold off. People talk about jobs and industries being shipped out to Mexico and to China in the system. This was based on a few factors. Mainly the fact that Richard Nixon had taken the United States off the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates. And if you remember Bob's slide on the energy flux densities, there was a shutdown in the physical economy where now you would usher in a post-industrial society or a consumer society with zero growth. Profit. So you have an exponential increase here in the amount of currency that's available, in the amount of revolving credit, which is credit cards, auto loans, mortgages. You saw, if you remember Bob's presentation, a massive increase